How long would it take to beat Factorio without any automation? While this might seem like a completely pointless question that doesn't need answering, it's actually a badly worded question too, because it's impossible to beat the game without at least some automation. Yeah, some sections of the game do rely on automated machines, and so this video is going to have to settle for how long it would take to beat the game using as little automation as possible. Even still, this isn't an easy question to answer. And given the length of this thing, some of you guys might want to skip to the end and find out the big number. If you want to do that, here's a timestamp, but I do recommend watching this thing to give some context to that answer. I've done my best to skim over the boring math so we can instead focus on problem solving and really bad memes. Also, before we get into things, I'd recommend just taking a second and having a guess as to how long it might take. For some frame of reference, the world record speedrun sits at 1 hour and 27 minutes, which, by the way, is absolutely insane. If you want a normal person perspective though, the game should take around 42 hours to beat on a first playthrough. Now, I would expect our time to be quite a bit longer than that, but before we can find out how much longer, we need to start with the rules. So obviously, the first rule of beating Factorio manually is that we have to do all mining and crafting by hand wherever possible. Secondly, at some points in the game, we'll be forced to use machines to progress. Usually that's because we can't do some form of crafting by manual means. In those scenarios, we'll use any machines that we need to, and pay for the electricity they use by manually mining for fuel. Then, the third and final rule is that the use of productivity and efficiency modules is banned. This was done partially because it would make the planning way harder, and also partially because the modules only work on automated machines, and that kinda goes against the theme of the video. So yeah, with the rules sorted, let's talk about how we're actually going to beat the game. Now, it should be obvious that I'm not actually going to be playing through all of Factorio manually, even if that would have been faster than it was to make this video otherwise. Instead, we're going to be using the power of math to calculate our final time. It's going to be a massive undertaking, so I've split up our overall process into 6 sections so that I can explain things as we go. The first of these sections is going to involve a quick setup and overview of how the numbers are going to work. After that, the next 4 sections will involve making a whole bunch of science packs and progressing through the technology tree on the way to unlocking the rocket. Then finally, stage 6 is where we build the rocket, launch it into space and beat the game. This is where we'll find out our final times for manual Factorio, plus a few asterisks that also need to be talked about. But before we can get into that, let's figure out how this thing actually works with stage 1. Stage 1 is the setup phase. In stage 1, we'll be building all the buildings we need to progress through the next few steps. There really isn't that much to build here. There's 2 science labs, 2 furnaces, and a basic steam power setup with just 1 turbine. The time it takes to build these machines is going to be a drop in the bucket compared to everything else. But that's not what's important about stage 1. Stage 1 is important because it acts as a tutorial phase. As in, I need to tell you guys about how we're actually going to be measuring time in this thing, and I need a way to format that, so here we are. We're going to be measuring time in just 2 main ways: a mining time and a crafting time. And since the game lets us mine and craft at the same time, the overall time for manual Factorio is going to be determined by which of these 2 takes the longest. Well, that's not entirely true, because what about the time you spend walking between resources? Or moving items between machines, building stuff, fighting off biters, looking through menus? You get the idea. There are so many things beyond mining and crafting that could contribute to the overall time. So why then am I not going to include these extra times in the calculations? Well, firstly, the time it takes to do all of these extra things depends massively on who's playing and what kind of map we're on. For example, if we have a map where all of the resources are really far apart, then there's going to be a lot of wasted time spent moving between the resources. But if we took a perfect map where everything we needed was right next to everything else we needed, then almost no time would have to be spent moving around. All of the other factors too, like building time and inventory management time, could also be reduced down to near zero given perfect play. Of course, even with these ideal circumstances, the extra times would still have some impact on the final number. But since we can't calculate them in a fair and reasonable way, I think the best idea would be to save talking about them until the end of the video once we've gotten a better idea about the process and numbers. So to summarise, we're not going to be considering all of these extra times that trend towards 0 as conditions improve. Instead, we'll be focusing on the concrete and measurable numbers for mining and crafting as the core of our calculations. So let's try an example for our mining and crafting time by looking at a science lab. To get the crafting time for a science lab, all we have to do is hover over the recipe in our crafting menu. From here, we can see that it takes 2 seconds to craft a science lab, or 22 seconds to make a science lab plus all of the subcomponents that go into it too. So for the purposes of our calculations, it effectively takes 22 seconds. Then there's also the mining time to consider, which gets a little more complex. A science lab needs 36 iron plates and 15 copper plates to craft, so if it takes us 2 seconds to mine an ore, that's 102 seconds of mining per science lab. But wait, there's more. For every piece of iron or copper ore we dig up, we also have to smelt that ore into plates. To do this, we'll need to spend some time mining to pay for the smelting fuel. Now, going into this, you might naturally think that coal is the best choice for fuel, but it's actually more efficient to use wood as a fuel source since it gives around 3.5 times as much fuel for the time you spend mining it. Sure, a few Amazon rainforests will have to be cut down, but that's not really an issue. The actual problem with deforesting everything is that once we dig out all the trees near our base, we'll have to go out further and further each time we want to get wood. So, to prevent this from happening, we'll have to be smart about how we mine our wood. The best solution to this problem is to deforest in thin lines going in and out from our base. If we can do this correctly, we should be able to efficiently cut down trees while ensuring we never have to travel too far each time we want to get more wood. Of course, all of this assumes that we don't get too ridiculous with the total number of trees we have to cut down. That's something that we can't really talk about though until the end of the video. For now, what matters is we need 7.34 wood, or 2.02 seconds of mining time, to pay for all the smelting that goes towards making a science lab. Now, if we add that to the other mining time, we get a total of 104 seconds to mine for a science lab. So yeah, now that we know how to calculate the time it takes to make a single item, all we have to do is apply that same math to every other item in stage 1. So once again, the things we're building in stage 1 include 2 science labs, 2 furnaces, and a basic steam power setup. Then if we add everything up, we get a total of 58 seconds of crafting and 316 seconds of mining to pay for everything in stage 1. It really doesn't seem like too much, but keep in mind that this is in a completely idealized world where things like moving between resources and inventory management don't get accounted for. So for comparison's sake, I did this whole stage myself and got a time of 9 minutes and 13 seconds. That's a difference of 4 minutes, or me taking about 75% longer than expected. Now, 75% is definitely a massive difference that kinda highlights the limitations of only focusing on a mining and crafting time. Though to be fair, the world seed wasn't too great, and there were plenty of things I could have optimized in my run. Also, during later stages, I'd expect a much smaller proportion of time to be spent travelling, since we'll be able to do everything in bulk. Now, the main thing I want to emphasise from this is that whatever time we calculate from the mining and crafting numbers, it's going to be an absolute minimum best case scenario. The true time to beat the game is definitely going to be something higher, but I wouldn't expect it to be anywhere near as big as 75%. Anyway, we can talk about that difference at the end of the video. For now, we're just going to be using the mining and crafting times to track everything. For all of stage 1, those times added up to 58 seconds of crafting and 316 seconds of mining. And now we can move on to stage 2. Before we get into stage 2, let's talk about the tech tree. To beat the game, we need to research a bunch of technologies on the way to unlocking the rocket. However, most of these technologies are going to be completely useless to us, since they tend to help with the automation that we're not allowed to do. In fact, there's only 3 technologies that'll actually help us by making our progression go faster. And these technologies are unlocked in stages 2, 3 and 4 of our process. The reason I've split things up into these stages is because when we unlock these technologies, our overall speed changes, like in stage 2, where we unlock the first of these technologies in the steel axe. With the steel axe, we mine ores and trees twice as fast. It's easily the most impactful technology we'll unlock all game, which is honestly kinda sad. It's also the only technology that doesn't build towards the rocket later on. So to unlock the steel axe technology, we first have to research all of its prerequisites. In this case, there's just one, and it's the steel processing tech. Unlocking technologies in Factorio requires two things: science packs and research time. By research time, I'm talking about the time the packs spend in the lab consuming electricity. For example, any set of science packs that goes towards the steel processing technology has to spend 5 seconds in the lab consuming power, or for the steel axe technology, it takes 30 seconds per set of science packs. This means for all of stage 1, we need about half an hour worth of lab usage time, which costs us around 14.4 seconds of mining to pay for the fuel. As for the 100 science packs, each science pack itself takes 5.5 seconds to craft and 6.12 seconds to mine. Multiply that by 100 and we now know everything there is to stage 2. In total, that's 550 seconds of crafting and 626 seconds of mining. Adding that to the previous stage, we get a total time of 15.7 minutes, which brings up a really interesting comparison. There's actually a speedrun category that does exactly what we've done here in unlocking the steel axe as fast as possible. And if we look at some of the times people are getting for this category, we could actually beat like 5+ people at the bottom of the leaderboard. Yeah, we're not even close to the world record. That time is around half of ours at 8 minutes 51. But even still, it's kind of funny that by doing a Factorio speedrun manually, we wouldn't be the last on the leaderboard. Anyway, that is stage 2, done in 15.7 minutes, let's keep going. So stage 3 is where we unlock the advanced material processing technology. It's a very fancy sounding name, but all this technology really does is lets us use steel furnaces. These steel furnaces smelt things twice as fast but use the same amount of fuel per second. So effectively, these furnaces are twice as efficient with fuel compared to the old ones. Once we have these things going, we'll only have to spend half as long digging up fuel for all of our smelting purposes. So to unlock these steel furnaces, we have to reach them on the tech tree. That means there are 2 technologies we'll be researching in stage 3. And between them, we'll need 150 red science packs, 75 green science packs, and 44 minutes of lab research time. I'm also going to be throwing in 2 steel furnaces into the calculations because, well, they wouldn't fit anywhere else. And yeah, that's kind of all there is to calculate in stage 3. If we combine the numbers together, we get 24.8 minutes of crafting and 18.5 minutes of mining. Pretty simple in terms of the math, but there is one more thing we have to talk about. Yeah. We're now limited by our crafting speed, which means that our overall time for stage 3 is going to be the same as our crafting time, right? Well, this raises the question of what would happen if we took the crafting we were doing in stage 3 and moved it to be earlier on during stages 1 and 2. Doing this, we could save some time that would have otherwise been spent not crafting anything. Unfortunately though, we don't want to do this for a few reasons. The main reason being, we can't craft items until we've mined for the resources that go into those items. It's that simple. We have to mine iron and copper before we can turn that iron and copper into science packs. Now, one way to get around this would be to do some of stage 3's crafting earlier on, which would also require some of stage 3's mining to be earlier too. The problem with doing this is that we only mine half as fast during stages 1 and 2. Meaning that any time we push back is effectively doubled in time and wasted. For that reason, and another reason that will become obvious later, we won't be pushing back any of stage 3's crafting to be earlier on. That means that stage 3 ends after 40.5 minutes, and now we can move on to stage 4. Stage 4 is where we unlock the advanced oil processing tech. And for anyone who's played Factorio before, you'll know that things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. That's because stage 4 adds the blue science back, and these guys break everything. Up until now, every science pack could be happily made using just our inventory and maybe a few smelting machines. But to make a blue science pack, we need to use not only a furnace, but also an oil drill, oil refinery, chemical plant, and crafting machine. This means we'll have to calculate our electricity usage for every blue science pack we make. kind of annoying, but no big deal. The actual big problem we'll be dealing with in Stage 4 is the complete collapse of the game's crafting recipes as a reliable source of information. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's compare the red science packs we've been making since Stage 2 to the blue science packs we're trying to make now. With the red science packs, it takes 2 iron plates, 1 copper plate, and 5.5 seconds of crafting. Pretty simple, right? Well, now let's try and figure out the same thing for the blue science pack. To make a blue science pack, we need 6 iron, 15 copper, and 2 engines, and 6 plastic, and a sulfur. Something isn't right here. These things that are listed under the raw materials section for a blue science pack aren't exactly raw materials. After all, the plastic, sulfur, and engine components all have complicated crafting processes themselves. So why then does the game list these things as raw? Well, these items are listed as raw here because they can't be crafted by hand. Now, that might not make much sense to anyone who knows what the definition of raw is, but it makes a lot of sense from a gameplay perspective. These items listed as raw ingredients are the lowest level ingredients possible if you wanted to craft the item by hand. This makes it convenient for normal players to find out all the resources they need to make something, but unfortunately for us, it complicates the calculation process, since the times listed under items like the blue science pack don't include the time needed to make these raw subcomponents. What this effectively means is that we can't rely on the numbers given by the game when trying to figure out our mining and crafting numbers. Instead, we're going to have to do the math ourselves to calculate all the times for each subcomponent, plus the electricity usage needed for all of the oil. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of fun math. And by that, I mean I'm just going to put up some final numbers, and you guys can pretend that you wanted to see the calculations, but trust me, you don't. The math that goes into calculating this stuff is really complex, but that doesn't make it interesting. So in order to save the viewer retention graph, I've decided to leave it out of the video. If you really want to look at it, I've put a link in the description to the Python code I've been using for all the numbers. There's a lot of cool stuff in there that I chose to cut for various reasons, but I'd just like to warn you that the code is a dumpster fire. I didn't write this thing with the intention of making it public, or good. I only wrote this thing so I could automate the math that I was doing manually. If you think that automating the math goes against the nature of the video, then I'd just like to remind you that beating Factorio manually is not a good idea. Anyway, we can now return to the calculations for Stage 4. According to the tech tree, we'll need 11 technologies made up of 1030 red science packs, 990 green science packs, and 75 blue science packs. We'll also need about 6 hours of lab time and all the buildings in the oil processing pipeline. Adding it all up, we get a total of 4.6 hours crafting and 3.4 hours mining for all of Stage 4. And since we're once again limited by our crafting speed, the final time for Stage 4 is just the crafting time. This leaves us with Stage 4 ending after 5.3 hours. Oh yeah, before we move on to Stage 5, I should probably mention why we've unlocked Advanced Oil Processing. So, the main thing that Advanced Oil Processing gives us is a new recipe that can be used at the oil refinery. This new recipe takes in the same amount of crude oil and electricity as the previous one, but it outputs more petroleum plus some light and heavy oil as byproducts. From now on, we'll be using this new recipe for all of our oil stuff. And this is where things get quite messy. With the introduction of light and heavy oil comes an absolute mountain of new complexity. Most of this new complexity stems from the fact that we can convert light and heavy oil down to petroleum through a process called cracking. For example, if we need some petroleum to pay for a blue science pack, we could maybe get some of this petroleum as a direct output from our refinery, and some of the remaining petroleum from cracking light oil down. We can save a decent amount of electricity by doing it this way, but it can make things a whole lot more complex. That's because right now we can't actually figure out how much of any oil products comes from cracking as opposed to just refining. This also makes it impossible to assign a concrete electricity usage and mining time to any recipe that uses oil. So what we're going to do to fix this is exclude the oils from any recipes that use them from here on out. That means all the petroleum, light, and heavy oil that goes into making various items is going to be set aside and calculated separately. Then, at the end of stage 6, once we've figured out our final oil numbers, we can do the math for how much drilling, refining and oil cracking we'll have to do. Don't worry if that doesn't make too much sense, because we'll go over it a wee bit more in stage 5. Okay, stage 5 is where we finally get to complete the tech tree. That means 25 new technologies being researched with over 15,000 science packs crafted by hand. As you can probably guess, stage 5 is going to take quite a while. Not only because we have such a massive number of science packs to craft, but also because a large share of these science packs will be of the new and expensive variety. Speaking of, there are 2 new science packs introduced in stage 5. Let's start with the purple science pack. Since we're not going to include the variable costs associated with some of the oil components, the time measurements here are going to be a little different. So to make a purple science pack, we're going to need 66.7 petroleum. And since we can't at the moment give a fixed price for this petroleum, we're going to set it aside. Then, excluding the cost it took to make that petroleum, we can say that it takes 51.2 seconds of crafting and 87.9 seconds of mining to make the rest of the science pack. It should be noted though that those times I just said include the time it takes to turn that petroleum into plastic, since that crafting recipe doesn't vary. The only thing that varies here is the cost of making the petroleum itself, because we don't know what proportion of the petroleum came from cracking as opposed to just normal oil processing. Hopefully that makes sense and you can see how the oil separation thing works. If not, we can go through it one more time with the yellow science pack. So the yellow science pack takes 101.7 petroleum plus 5 heavy oil. Then otherwise the rest of the yellow science pack takes 65.6 seconds crafting and 88.3 seconds of mining. And yeah, that's kinda all we have to do in stage 5. Now we just multiply the science packs by the time they take, and add in enough electricity to pay for 55 hours of lab usage time, and we can get our final numbers. Those numbers, by the way, are 92.1 hours of crafting and 105.5 hours of mining. So yeah, stage 5 is pretty big. And keep in mind, we're not even including the time it takes to drill, refine and crack all the oil products. To add in those numbers though, we'll have to do a bit of work at the end of stage 6. Plus, we'll also have to talk about the graph, because that's gotten a bit funky. Anyway, those chats will come later. For now, let's just move on to stage 6. Okay, we're finally here. Stage 6, we get to build the rocket. And since we already know how the calculation process works, we can skip over a few things and keep things nice and simple. There are 2 things that we're going to be making in stage 6. First up is the rocket silo, and this one item takes an obscene amount of resources to craft. We'll only need 1 rocket silo, but even still, making this thing adds over 6 hours to our total mining time. And once we've made the silo, we're still not done. That's because the second part of stage 6 is where we actually build the rocket, and it's a little different from a normal crafting recipe. Building the rocket is done by putting a bunch of components into the rocket silo, and then the silo turns those components into a rocket in some process that apparently uses electricity. What matters to us is that to make a rocket we need 1,000 each of low density structures, rocket fuel and rocket control units, plus about 5.5 seconds of mining time to pay for the electricity used by the silo. Yeah, okay, the electricity isn't worth anything here, but the other components really add up to something big. So on screen now are the crafting times, mining times and oil requirements for all of these 3 items. The only one I really want to talk about here is the rocket fuel, because it has an interesting component called solid fuel. Solid fuel is an item that can be crafted with 3 different recipes. 1 recipe for each of the oil types that we've been using so far. So then the question is, which oil type do we want to use? And unfortunately, the optimal answer to this question is not so simple. What I'm going to do is say that we'll use light oil for the purposes of this calculation, but later on I'll explain how it's a lot more complicated than that and we could save a little bit of time. But for now, we'll just be putting everything together and figuring out a final cost per rocket. Those numbers are 45.2 hours of crafting and 42.7 hours of mining. Then if we combine that with the time it took to make the rocket base, we get 47.9 hours of crafting and 49.0 hours of mining. And yeah, that's everything we have to make to beat Factorio. All we have to do now is calculate all the stuff for oil and add it back in to get a final time. This also includes all the oil stuff that we didn't get to talk about from stage 5. So the final counts for how much oil we need is 580,000 petroleum, 110,000 light oil, and 9,500 heavy oil. Then if we compare that to the output from advanced oil processing, it looks like we'll have to do a little bit of oil cracking to convert between the various types. When cracking, there's a ratio of 40 heavy oil to 30 light oil to 20 petroleum. Before we use these ratios to figure out how much cracking we have to do, let's first figure out how much crude oil we need to drill and process. If we use the conversion ratios to pretend that all of our oil is in the form of petroleum, we get the equivalent of around 660,000. If we were to also convert the outputs from advanced oil processing into this petroleum form, we'd end up with around 6,700 usages of the advanced oil processing recipe. So now we can use that 6,700 usages of the recipe and multiply that by the outputs of the recipe to find out what our oils look like before we crack them. We can then compare those numbers against the required amounts of oil to find out how much cracking we have to do. Then we can figure out our energy usages in terms of a drilling, processing and cracking amount. Those energy usages can then be combined and converted into an equivalent mining time. For all of the oil stuff in stages 5 and 6, we get a mining time of about 30 minutes. Honestly, it's not that long, and there is still room to improve this time if we did a few optimizations here and there. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get into that because it complicates things way too much, and the mining time for oil stuff is already small enough that it won't really matter. Anyway, with all of that done, we now know everything there is to stages 5 and 6. Including the oil stuff, these stages take 140 hours of crafting and 155 hours of mining. So yeah, these two stages kind of dwarf anything that came earlier. To compare them visually, I've redrawn the Gantt chart that we were using earlier, but to scale this time. And yeah, the size comparisons speak for themselves, but there's something else that I want to talk about here. If we look at the times from stages 3 and 4, we have some small sections where we aren't mining anything. Also, with stages 5 and 6, we're limited by our mining speed. So you might think that in this situation, we could do some of the mining from stages 5 and 6 earlier on. And you would be exactly right. By doing our mining earlier, we can save over an hour from our final time. That final time, by the way, is now the exact same length as the total mining time for the entire game. So yeah, the total time it takes to beat Factorio is just the sum of all the mining times from all 6 stages. And that time is, welcome back by the way if you skipped the entire video, 158.7 hours. That's about 6.6 days straight, or 4 full working weeks at a 9-to-5 job. To put that time into perspective, it's more than 100 times longer than the world record speedrun. It's also around 3.7 times longer than the average time expected to beat the game on a first playthrough. However, it is only about a sixth of the time it would take to progress through a skyblock game if you had one block of grass and absolutely nothing else. Yeah, this is a shameless plug for the other video on my channel. But I think it's a really cool video if you can get over the fact that my mic sounds deep fried. Anyway, before this video actually ends, we have a few more bonus questions to talk about. Okay, first question. How many trees do we have to cut down? Well, to beat the game, we need 81.7 thousand wood, which means about 36,000 going towards power and 46,000 going towards smelting. If each tree gives us 4 wood, that means 20.4 thousand trees will have to be cut down, which looks something like this. Yeah, that's a lot of trees we have to cut down, and we probably will have to spend a little bit of time moving between the resources here. Which leads into the next thing I want to talk about. How long would it realistically take for a human to beat the game? Given the massive list of things that could add to the overall time, I've decided to set up 4 different multipliers for the actual amount of time that a human could take. This includes the 75%, which I think is way too big and ridiculous, and some more realistic numbers for humans that are around 10 and 25%. I've also put in a number for a speedy robot who is playing like a task or something. So given these multipliers, these are the times we should expect based on our mining time. Now, I'm not going to get too much into these numbers because they are just made up and arbitrary, but I will say that if you wanted a canonical time for how long a human would take to beat Factorio manually, I'd say something like 200 hours, at least on someone's first attempt. Now, if 200 hours of wasted time isn't enough, then this next question might be quite interesting. How long would it take to research every single technology in the game? To find out this time, we'll be taking our calculations up until stage 5 and then adding in every remaining technology in the game, though we will be excluding the ones that require space science packs because those can go infinite. This means a total of 145 technologies to research and about 230,000 science packs to make by hand. Now, I'm not going to get too into the numbers here because we've seen pretty much the entire process of this before. Instead, I'm just going to throw some stuff into the code and get our final times. These final times are a bit bigger than the other ones. It takes 61.1 days of crafting and 76 days of mining to unlock everything. Yep, that's a pretty big number, and I don't know what else to say. Except, thank you for watching the video, and seriously, if you made it the entire way through, that means a lot. If you didn't, whatever, you're still here anyway, that counts for something. This thing's taken a really long time to make, so I would seriously appreciate it if you shared it with your friends, or if you don't have any friends, just like it and then YouTube can send it on to other people who might be interested.